Sunday marked 5 years since the murder of George Floyd, caught on camera, sparking nationwide protests and calls for social justice and police reform. NBC's Shaq Brewster was on the ground during the protests and has been covering the response from cities and police departments, even as Congress failed to act.
George Floyd! Allow the George Floyd!
5 years after George Floyd's murder under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer put law enforcement across America in the spotlight, changes to policing swept through the country despite federal reform failing to pass.
The biggest change since 2020 is that states now have a larger role in policing.
Since May 2020, more than 1,500 policing-related bills have been enacted across nearly every state, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. A number that doesn't include what we saw and covered within individual departments.
It's going to get some pushback and resistance.
Like in Charlotte, where in 2021, Chief Johnny Jennings launched a mandatory customer service training for officers, working with the same consulting firm used by companies like Disney and Chick-fil-A.
We wanted to take a customer service approach. We wanted to look at how can we be the best part of somebody's worst day.
Today, the department says external complaints are down 61%. Officer-involved shootings fell 43%, as more than 4 in 10 officers say they have applied what they've learned.
And we're sitting in on some of that training for new recruits. The chief says it's constantly updating, constantly evolving, and that his department is working with 10 others across the country interested in launching similar courses.
How much do you credit this customer service training for those declines?
I have to credit it. I mean, there's no other explanation. They're going to make mistakes. But at the same time, if the community knows that you're working to improve those relationships, how you respond and treat the community, they're going to give you a little bit more leeway when something does happen.
In 2022, we saw departments quickly joining a Georgetown University training project focused on peer intervention and the duty to intervene.
I appreciate you guys having open minds with respect to this training.
That training and its annual refreshers expanded from 179 departments then to 420 today, even as administrators say they're battling a decline in philanthropic support.
It's not only about the intervention, it's also about being willing to accept it.
Yeah, those are the two biggest parts.
Experts say the most lasting shifts are being seen in policing alternatives.
I would much rather our officers not have to engage in the mental health crisis, but it's here.
Like in Detroit, where in 2023, we rode along with the SWAT-like mental health response unit that's still expanding today under new leadership. But there's also been a national push to boost support for individual officers.
Around 2022, 2023, we start to see a little bit more focus also on police well-being themselves, focusing on making sure that officers had access to mental health support.
And more than 63 state laws targeting police recruitment and retention. 99% of Detroit's officer vacancies have been filled after the department increased pay and offered seniority incentives for returning officers.
When you have community morale and police morale that is high, now you have a community that is willing to take the oath and become police officers.
Charlotte activist Robert Dawkins in 2021 told us he was skeptical of the impact of changes being proposed.
We've tried all of these different things, but you cannot reform what's in somebody's heart.
Today,
do you still believe that policing is unreformable?
I do. We do appreciate the work that the police are doing now. This mitigation and stuff that they do now builds goodwill, but that goodwill leaves in the spur of the moment. You're just one bad police shooting away from it happening again.
Back in Minneapolis, former police chief Madera Arredondo says reform is a work in progress, but that it starts with individual officers.
I know police agencies have really, around the country, have been trying to do the best they can, whether it's hiring, recruitment, retention, but all of that pales in comparison if you don't make sure you're bringing on people with character. And that character did not exist out here the night of May 25th, 2020.
5 years of police reform, falling short of many demands, but back in the spotlight today.
And NBC's Shaq Brewster joins me now from Minneapolis. Obviously, Shaq, you have done some exhaustive reporting on this topic. And despite what we just saw in your piece there are still a high number of officer-involved killings. And the political momentum for this reform appears to have shifted to some degree. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a great point that you make, and that's because if you look at the number of people killed by police, it's higher in 2024 than it was even back in 2020. And yeah, the political momentum, it has not only shifted, it's almost completely flipped. You know, this past week, we saw the Trump administration roll back the investigations and those court-enforced agreements between the federal government and cities like Louisville and Minneapolis police. Now, the cities are saying they're still going to continue those changes. They're going to enact every reform that was agreed to in those agreements. But that speaks to the frustration that you hear from people on the ground. We heard it all throughout the weekend, that the change that they went out and protested for back in 2020, they feel like it's not just not happening, but in some cases, it's being reversed.
And you went to George Floyd's memorial this weekend. What did you hear from members of his community now 5 years after his death?
Yeah, you hear a lot of pain. There's still open wounds. I think the Star Tribune put it well this morning when they said there are open wounds still left to heal or slow to heal at this point. That was a sentiment you heard as we saw a weekend of commemoration there at George Floyd Square. That's the exact intersection where he was killed. You heard people go to panel discussions. There was a gala to essentially honor members of the community. And then last night we saw a candlelight vigil at the actual moment where George Floyd was killed. You hear that tension again where there's the hope that there's change, but there's also understanding that there's still a lot of pain that people are feeling 5 years later, Ryan.
Yeah, hard to believe it's been 5 years. Shaq, Brewster, thanks for all your reporting on this. We appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.